Hi, I'm Stephen Orr, and when you hear the term summer squash, generally you might think of these yellow squash here that are available pretty much all year round in the supermarket, but there's really a lot of other varieties of summer squash, and they're really easy to grow. So one of the most common summer squashes is zucchini, and a few years ago, if you told people we're having zucchini for dinner, they would have been like, bored, but actually, zucchinis are now a kind of a cool vegetable because of zoodles, zucchini noodles. People use their spiralizer. It's a kind of a low starch, low carbohydrate way to substitute for pasta and spaghetti. They work well in all sorts of Italian dishes. I think people have discovered that zucchinis are a really great plant to kind of combine with a lot of different flavor profiles. Another one that's really beautiful is called a Zephyr. This is just a visual thing. It is the same flavor basically as a zucchini or a yellow summer squash, but it has this nice bicolor. Something like this, it's really good to show it off is to eat it raw. And when you think of eating squash raw, it sounds kind of maybe a little bland. One way I like to do it is to use a vegetable peeler and just peel it off in big strips, big flat strips, and then lay it down on a plate, squeeze some lemon on the top and let that sit for about half an hour. That will kind of almost cook the squash, and then put some olive oil and salt and pepper and pesto or whatever you want on top, and you have a really great way to show this beautiful color when you lay these skins down that way. Another great summer squash is patty pan. This is a beautiful white one, or these little guys here. These are all really good. You can just chop them into pieces. Usually I would carve them like pie pieces, and so you can really see the colors. And then you can either steam them or bake them, roast them. All of those preparations work really well. If you put them in bite-sized pieces, it works really well in all sorts of pasta. So all of these plants are beautiful and really versatile, kind of a great base to add all sorts of different spice mixtures. Zucchinis and summer squashes and patty pan, they grow on vining or trailing plants. Sometimes they're bushy. The zucchinis can be like a big bush, but even those bushy plants take up quite a lot of space. So you probably not need a lot of these. It's a heavy producer. Pick them this size or smaller. The more you pick of squash, the more it will produce. So the best way to do it is to take a few seeds. Most of these varieties come in all these different great seed packets. All you really need to do is plant those, about 4 or 5 seeds in a hill or in rows, and then thin them out by snipping out the extra plants you don't want, and then let those grow to full size. As they grow and start to bloom, each of those yellow flowers will turn into a squash. So the best way to get the most squash is to take a paintbrush or even your finger and go from plant to plant the way a bee would, just to make sure that they're all pollinated, because all of those pollinated flowers will turn into a fruit. And the more, as I said, the more you pick, the more fruit you'll have. And picking these small is actually a really good way to use them as well. You could pickle them, you could use them small in salads. So just keep picking your squash, and the more you pick, the more they'll come. They're annual vines, so once they're done, you can just throw the vines out and discard them. Squash can be really bothered by pests. They get the vine borer, they get cucumber beetles. There's a variety of different pests that can attack summer squash. So just keep an eye out for those. Look for organic ways to solve that problem. If you do need to use any sort of insecticide, go for something like pyrethrum or something that is less toxic. And you just want to keep those pests under control. If you do find you have pests one year, move your plants around, crop rotate in case the previous year's beetles are hanging out in the soil. They'll have a harder time finding the plants later on. So if you have a smaller space garden, some of these smaller zucchinis or some of the squash that grow in a bush form, those are good for containers. You'll get a lot of produce from one container. And also you can try to grow them up instead of out. So you could try some of the more vining types, you can try to train up a trellis. That way you can keep an eye on the plants and you won't have to have so much space to grow them. And wherever you grow your squash, just make sure you water regularly. Water once a week very deeply around the roots. Don't spray the plants as much as possible, because you do want to avoid mildew and other fungi that will harm the leaves and harm the plant production. So as we said earlier, harvesting the zucchini, this is about an optimal size to harvest them for a tender, delicious zucchini. But you can also make them the size of just a couple of inches. All of these can be grown where they're very, very small, and just use kind of like a starter or something to put in a salad, just because they're so beautiful even when they're tiny. When you're picking the zucchini off the vines and the plants, just make sure you cut the plants. Don't try to tug them off. You're going to damage both the fruit and the plant if you tug it. Just make sure you cut it with a knife. It's the best way to get the fruit off the vine. When you're growing or buying zucchini and summer squash, just make sure, because the skins are so fragile, if you're meaning to keep them around for a little while, make sure that they don't have any breaks or damage in them, because any sort of damage or bruising will make the fruit start to rot. You know these are really ready and they're not too hard. If you can pierce the skin easily with your fingernail, that's a good tip that this plant is ready. But once you do pierce it, you want to cook it pretty quickly. Unlike winter squash, summer squash are meant to be used really quickly, within a week generally. And I tend to keep mine out at room temperature, but if I worry I'm not going to cook them fast enough, I can pop them in the fridge. It'll make them last a little longer. But they don't have the hard, waxy coating that a winter squash has, so they won't last as long. So in these last few weeks of summer, it's just great to have these plants producing so prolifically, and the more you pick, the more they'll produce all the way till frost.